So welcome everyone to the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum Summer Speaker Series. It's sad not to be gathering together in the corn barn, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to continue to talk and think together about this important place and the many lives, famous and virtually unknown, that have been lived here. We'll be recording this session so you can view it or other talks in this series at a later time. And you can find the museum on the link, the events links for the museum website. We'll keep the chat open throughout this talk, so you can post questions and comments there during the presentation if you want, but I really hope people will save them and speak them at the end of Anna's talk. The Porter-Phelps-Huntington farmstead that houses this local history museum occupies the homeland of Pecumtuck, Nonotuck, Mohawk, Nipmuc, and Mohican peoples, displaced by the arrivals of European families like the Porters, who came to Hadley in the 17th century and built this house in 1752. The museum recognizes the responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession alongside enslavement that generated the wealth reflected in this historic house and museum. Using collections, interpretation, programming, and through collaborative relationships, the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum is working to examine, address, and reflect on these difficult but necessary histories. This series, Bridging the Past and Present, is part of that process. And one of the things that just struck me today, getting ready for this talk, is how much prior talks have connected to the Hadley Farm Museum, and Anna Plummer's talk today has connections to the Emily Dickinson Museum. And so, as well as bridging the past and present, this series also feels to me like it's beginning to make a kind of cultural bridge between the many wonderful museums in this region. And the Bridging the Past and Present series is supported by a Bridge Street grant from Mass Humanities, whose mission is to lead and support humanities programs to improve civic life in Massachusetts. Mass Humanities is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mass Cultural Council, and the generosity of their donors. This summer, the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum remains closed for tours and on-site programming. But we're delighted to be able to offer these bridging presentations about the history of this place and the many generations of diverse peoples who lived and worked here. The National Scenic Byway Trail System that begins at the museum remains open for hikers this summer. And while the house itself is closed to visitors, the museum's wonderful group of summer interns are busily engaged in an array of preservation and reinterpretation projects so as to be ready to tell more and different stories when we reopen next summer. We hope to see you in person in the summer of 2022. I'm Karen Sanchez-Epler, Professor of American Studies and English at Amherst College and newly president of the board of the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation. If you appreciate this place and the work we're striving to do and enjoy today's free programming, we hope you'll use the donate button on the Porter-Phelps-Huntington website to make a donation in support of the museum. It's now my enormous pleasure to introduce Anna Plummer, who I had the real joy of teaching in many courses, including one on Emily Dickinson during her years as a student at Amherst College, where she earned her BA in English and Theater and Dance in 2020. Anna is an emerging public history professional and a creative artist of great insight and talent. She started working at the Emily Dickinson Museum when she was in high school and has continued there as a tour guide, and most recently assisted in the development of the Dickinson Museum's virtual programming. She interned at the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum during the summer of 2019, where her curiosity about Susan Phelps first sparked. In fall 2019, I had the joy of working with her on an independent research project exploring the relationship between these two friends, and today's talk is a fruit of those curiosities. It's all yours, Anna. So glad to get to hear this work again.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen, for that introduction. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. We will get started. All right, so hello to everyone watching at home, and thank you to the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum for having me. I'm so grateful to feel a part of the PPH family, and I think I only grow in this feeling as I research the Phelpses, Porters, and Huntingtons themselves. There is so much that we can learn from studying this family, and I am particularly happy for us to consider today how this history can shape and illuminate the ways we read such influential American poetic literature as Emily Dickinson's. Susan Phelps resided at Phelps Farm from her birth in 1827 to her death in 1865. And she was the youngest child of Charles or Moses Phelps, sometimes nicknamed Porter, and of Charles's second wife, Charlotte Parsons, who died when Susan was only 3. I began this research with the aim to deepen Susan's story beyond that of a woman defined by oversimplified Victorian New England intrigue, that she died in her 30s of a broken heart after breaking off her own engagement. The smattering of family diary entries previously studied vaguely referenced a sick and fretful young woman, but with a look at her own writing and her place within this otherwise richly documented family and community, I think Susan Phelps appears more brightly than, as one Dickinson biographer writes, a mere friend about whom almost nothing is known. Phelps left behind a few major threads to follow, and I have just this summer had the privilege of looking at newly recovered papers from Phelps Farm pertaining to her. So today I'd like to share some of the moving details from these family papers, along with the story of where Phelps's and Emily Dickinson's lives intersect. And afterwards, I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you, your thoughts and questions. This is the family tree, which we'll be referring back to. So no need to memorize quite yet. So to get to know Susan first, let's jump ahead and hear her own words penned when she was 37. This first letter I encountered of Susan Phelps represented her well with its exuberant dashes and lively social recountings. On a Thursday in 1864, she had a busy week both behind and ahead of her as she launched into these 10 pages addressed to her 20-something niece, Ellen Bullfinch. I am constrained to take time by the forelock, she wrote, so we'll commence the weekly today. The tidings that follow offer a window into the woman's life in full blossom 4 years after her broken engagement and just 1 year before her death. By this time, Susan was confident within her community and still inspirited by her natural surroundings. She recounts embarking towards, as she called it, that city on a hill with family members to attend what was probably an exhibition of physical culture and military drills at Amherst College. Our drive was perfectly lovely. Words cannot describe the glory of the scenery or the freshness of the morn as we drove up through the college grove and came in sight of the hall. The sounds of the tolling bell and jovial voices told us the sophomores had the floor. To me, these seem the words of someone who took pleasure in the small things. She continues, few were in the gallery then, so we took possession of the best seats. The sophomores seemed to be under very good discipline. They marched well, and we heard them sing When Johnny Comes Marching Home. The only face we knew among them was that young man from Hatfield the Dickinsons are educating. Have forgotten his name. The hall was not empty long, perhaps 15 minutes, in which we laughed and chatted, waiting as patiently as we could. As she goes on to describe their encounters with several familiar seniors and faculty, the letter reveals that Susan maintained a wealth of friendships at Amherst College. This was years after her courtship and long engagement with an Amherst College graduate had ended. The Dickinsons, of course, were other friends that kept Susan and her family tied to Amherst through the war years. Since Susan and Emily's friendship began through Susan's engagement to Henry von Emmons in 1854, seems only to have strengthened after the engagement broke off in 1860, and then continued through the end of Susan's life in 1865. Their closest years exactly spanned the Civil War. Their friendship also spanned, therefore, Emily Dickinson's most productive writing years. While Susan applauded at the exhibition and even sang at the piano upon her friend's insistence, Emily would have avoided such a public event and its military pomp and circumstance. But each woman responded in her own way to national and personal turbulence. Dickinson sometimes applauded the military hero in her poetry. She wrote, "It may be a renown to live. I think the men who die, those unsustained saviors, present divinity." In the same year as Susan's letter, however, Dickinson would write to a Norcross cousin, "Sorrow seems more general than it did, and not the estate of a few persons since the war began. And if the anguish of others helped one with one's own, now would be many medicines." Curiously, Dickinson seems successful in offering that sympathetic medicine in the letter that best marks her friendship with Susan Phelps. In this paraphrase of Isaiah 43:2, with an enclosed rosebud, Dickinson said, "When thou goest through the waters, I will go with thee," just days after Susan ended her engagement. The recipient slipped the rosebud into her personal Bible, where it remained for over a century. And its last public viewer, J. Leda, did not note between which pages. Whether navigating her place in a country that faced its own unraveling, or the end of a relationship that once promised her great happiness, Susan operated with a determined optimism. Cousin Theodore Huntington would later describe her as retiring and imaginative. But alongside this, her letters crystallize a lighthearted and cheerful demeanor. Up one morning in 1863 at 3:30 to prepare a hot breakfast for some visitors, she focuses on their dear little baby, bright as a bird. She relays difficult news without analysis, rarely dwelling on it, though it's possible this sometimes came at the expense of ignoring deeper, nagging concerns. So far, her only known mention of fiancé Henry Emmons is this single sentence, which I was excited to discover this summer. It says, "No news of a settlement yet from Henry, yet he has had preaching quite often." Henry's unsettled pastorship after he completed theological seminary might have played into her decision not to marry him. What her letters make clear, however, is that Susan Phelps lived for the little celebrations, the songs, pies, serendipitous social calls, and especially times together with family. And here's that family tree. Immersing myself in this unique family has been the most striking part of coming to know Susan. As the youngest of 9, Susan's sense of self developed in direct relationship to her siblings. The oldest 6 shared the memory of their mother, Sarah Parsons, Charles' beloved first wife, and the woman for whom Phelps Farm was established. These individuals, for the most part, led stable lives. The few who remained in Hadley contributed especially to the nurturing of their younger half-siblings, which included Susan. Here you can see all the Phelps siblings, including in italics the ones who did not reach adulthood. So Susan had 6 older half-siblings and 3 full siblings. And Charles's third wife, Elizabeth Judkins, also brought along her 3 young adult daughters when she moved to Phelps Farm. So quite a few. Caroline, Marianne, and Sarah also stood in as mother figures for the young Susan. 22 years Susan's senior and a mainstay at the farm all the way through 1886. It's thanks to the diaries of Sarah Phelps, painted here by her niece, Ellen Bullfinch, that the days surrounding the end of her littlest sister's engagement are at all described. Arthur Phelps's presence in Susan's letters show her deep attachment to her siblings. She writes, "Hattie has a sort of fancy that Arthur may possibly come up. How I wish he could." And when he did not visit, and when he did visit the next year, she sent the sweetest letter of all. "I have just come up from the kitchen where I've been making the peach pies for dinner. You know they are A's favorite dessert. It does us good to see how well and happy A then seems. With his departure impending, she reported feeling more than a little blue about being left. To a younger cousin, Arthur embodied our ideal gentleman of the time, and his papers reflect the same loyalty." A decade after Susan's peach pie, he continued to write from his Boston office to brother William, paying close attention to William's birthday wish for a drum of figs. Arthur also came to stay at the farm during the few days Susan struggled toward her decision to end her engagement. I am so grateful that this letter was salvaged. It draws attention to an exceptional quality of the Phelps siblings and the three brothers also, who may have most influenced Susan's role among them. Both notes to brother William that you see here are set in uncharacteristically large script compared to Arthur's other letters. And though both men were in their 50s, content and writing style is juvenile by the Phelps's literary standards. Immediate brothers to Susan, William, and Theophilus, and her oldest half-brother Charles, each lived with severe mental illnesses. Arthur's note may have catered to Billy's intellectual challenges, and none of their stories are alike, but the brothers' dependency and conspicuous reputation added a certain weight to the domestic responsibilities of the Phelps girls. Please read more about Charles and Theophilus in my article on the PPH website. And I'd also say for the interns that are present, these are lives that beg more research attention. But I'd like to share with you a little bit more about Billy. And here he is. Thanks to his gregarious nature and habit of wandering, Billy Phelps was perhaps best known in the town and appears most frequently in family accounts. His mental impairment affected his ability to speak and socialize normally. Family members recalled that his particular language was a scramble of original sounds and syllables, select terms, and also Shakespearean and biblical phrases. He announced rain with the phrase, "High dew, hush the dust," and had a clear sense of humor. It's impossible to know exactly what conditions he might or might not have lived with according to today's medical standards, but his steady presence at Phelps Farm made Susan a much needed caretaker as well as the youngest child once in need of her own looking after. Still, Susan's reports are nothing but gentle praise. In a week when poor weather prevented a long-anticipated house call, she wrote to Nell Bullfinch, "So muddy we didn't want to take the carriage out, and this afternoon was so dreadful that nobody wished to go, only Billy. He has been faithful all day." She is quick to report that Billy has not made us the least trouble since A&H, which is Arthur and his wife Hattie, arrived. They are the best friends in the world. He loves Hattie dearly. And shares when Willie is very obliging and pleasant. His errands to town did not go unappreciated, his birthday given every hurrah. Somewhat distinct from their Huntington cousins, all the Phelps siblings seemed bonded by a deeply forgiving and generous respect for life. And I cannot leave out Charlotte Phelps, who was closest in age to Susan and her best friend through what their cousin called a bright, happy, and lovely youth. The two were inseparable companions, Charlotte an impulsive, practical, and competent complement to Susan's quiet charms. And yet, unlike as they were passionately fond of each other, their cousin later described. The sisters sang exceptionally and were highly sought after for social entertainment. Unfortunately, Susan's death dealt a terrible blow to Charlotte. from which she never fully recovered. After a few lonely years drifting between Hadley and Boston and an unhappy marriage in 1869, Charlotte eventually returned home with suffering health, was committed to an asylum in Hartford, and tragically took her own life. Patterns of suffering, emotional and mental health emergent in this family don't explain Susan's abrupt breakup or death, but they do bring up lots of questions. The exact reason that Susan ended her engagement in 1860 remains uncertain, but it appears she suffered an anxious response. On May 6th, Sister Sarah recorded, "Susan is still unwell, owing to trouble in consequence of feeling obliged to break off her engagement with Henry, linking her physical health with a distressed mental state." Sarah's diary also indicates that Susan experienced asthma and other complications throughout her life, and this prolonged period of pressing decisions and fearful anticipation may have exacerbated pre-existing conditions. On May 8th, Sarah wrote, "Henry Emmons came very unexpectedly this morning and had a long conversation with Susan and afterward with Arthur. The engagement is broken off entirely." So now to focus on the friendship with Emily Dickinson. It may have been thanks to a sibling that Susan had ultimately met Emily Dickinson. It appears Henry von Emmons was courting Eliza Judkins, Susan's stepsister, and a former teacher of Emily Dickinson's, even the year before his engagement to Susan was announced. Perhaps it was through Eliza that Susan and Henry became better acquainted. But from the warmth and excitement of their initial meeting to the cold months that followed Susan's death, Emily Dickinson and Susan Phelps's friendship quietly persisted through 10 years of change and trial for both women. Its end marked Dickinson's deepest retreat into reclusivity. They met in the energy of their early adulthood, both on the liminal cusp of a new phase of life. Emily was about to lose close friends to their new offices and pulpits now that they were graduating from Amherst College, and she had already watched several of her female companions marry and move away. Alfred Habiger writes that year's commencement proved unusually packed, painful, and clarifying for the Dickinsons. Susan was 27 and had just agreed to marry Henry von Emmons. She could enjoy the promise of moving out of Phelps Farm in a few years, where even as the youngest child, she shared some responsibility caring for her family in the bustling farm household. Emily and Susan also had Emmons in common. Introduced to the poet by her cousin John Graves, Emmons was Dickinson's favorite student friend for sharing all things literary, private carriage rides, and current wine. Henry even edited the quirky student publication, The Indicator, and gave an oration at his commencement ceremony that year, and then went on to become a reverend. In the summer of 1854, Emmons had just announced his engagement to Susan Phelps. And days before his August 10th graduation ceremony, Dickinson wanted to know whether his fiancée could spare a moment to visit her North Pleasant Street home, pictured here. "Will your friend be in town this evening?" she wrote. Oh, we'll get to that in a moment. "If so, can't you steal her away a little while from the exercises and bring her to me?" Finally, on one August day, Emily was given her chance to assess the match. And it went well. The conditions were just right. Susan was imaginative, naturally cheerful, and beaming with the freshness of her engagement. And the women were mutually curious. Susan had likely already received an earful from Henry about his feisty writer friend, and Dickinson had been granted her wish on an important condition, that she receive the visitor at her own home. Dickinson's response suggests conversation did not run dry. At the week's conclusion, she reflected on Emmons' departure and reported to her sister-in-law, Susan Dickinson, that he brought his Hadley friend to pass the day with me, and we passed it very sweetly. Her name is Susie too, and that endeared me to her. Make sure. Though Emily had 3 fewer years than Susan, The younger assumed a role closer to that of an older sister. Susan's sweet nature fit her inoffensively into Dickinson's highly controlled social sphere. Beyond possible but unconfirmable height differences, this seems to suit Dickinson's nickname in their one definitive correspondence. Before the comforting words Dickinson offered to her friend in 1860, she addressed Susan as petite. Susan was used to playing the younger sister, and the Phelps household had made her amenable to a breadth of unusual personality types. Whatever ensued over the course of the visit, Susan stepped out onto the warm Amherst evening with an extraordinary new acquaintance. And Dickinson was quite taken herself. She wrote this to Emmons first thing the following day. "My heart is full of joy, friend. Were not my parlor full, I'd bid you come this morning, but the hour must be stiller in which we speak of her. Of her I cannot write, yet I do thank the Father who's given her to you, and wait impatiently to speak with you. Please not regard the ride unless it be most convenient. My hand trembles. Truly and warmly, Emily." This is a good time to mention, somewhat on a side note, that Susan Phelps, her father had a reputation as an overbearing, quote, dragon of a figure. He passed away before Susan became unwell, as her sister wrote, but her father's discouragement against his children marrying may have still factored in. By 1864, had Dickinson heard about Charles Phelps's dragon-like guardianship when she thanked the Father who has given her to you? Charles was still alive and mentally robust at the time of the engagement. Dickinson's capitalization also suggests God's providence, but the phrase does raise suspicions. From Susan and Emily's first meeting in 1860, little survives by way of direct correspondence, but the women likely confided in one another. They made several visits, and Dickinson also grew acquainted with Charlotte. Sarah Phelps's diary records a few of these visits with Susan's friend, Miss Dickinson. The poet, for by this time she was even willing to make the lengthy trip to Hadley. Among Susan's keepsakes, the family saved a very Dickinson-esque calling card, a pebble with her signature. And by March of 1859, Dickinson counted 2 Sues among the closest 5 who comprehend my girls, one of them widely assumed to be Susan Phelps. Emily must have enjoyed arriving with Lavinia at Pine Grove, as Phelps Farm was sometimes called, and passing under the archway into its sunny front hall. The Phelpses kept their library enticingly stocked, first thing on the left, and Amherst visitors walked by it on their way to the sitting room. Biographer Polly Longsworth posits that Susan Phelps was also the recipient of an additional letter Dickinson wrote in 1858. And though many assume that the greeting of Susie in this famous note refers to Susan Dickinson, the content bears a more striking match with Susan Phelps. Declining a social invitation, Emily excused herself with, "I am from the fields, you know, and will quite at home with the dandelion, make but sorry figure in the drawing room." And she finishes, "Thank you for your frequent coming and the flowers you bring. Thank you for the glad laugh which I heard this morning, though I did not see you. I will keep them all till I reach my other Susie, whose sweet face you bring afresh every day you come. Affectionately, Emily." These last lines contain some mystery about this other Susie. Dickinson could be referring to both friends, or as Longsworth puts it, juxtaposing a spiritual, unseen Susie revealed by signs and the bodily Susie whom she expects to see before long. In any case, the language takes a pleasant tone, much unlike the bolder correspondences with Susan Dickinson. A glad laugh and a sweet face fit well with Phelps's reputed demeanor, and even Dickinson's description of their first meeting. Though well-loved, in fact, probably more, the sharp-witted, often critical Susan Dickinson was not known for her sweetness. The poet experienced a flurry of change and activity in her life from 1860 to 1865, yet during this time, Dickinson's friendship with Susan Phelps deepened. Still, the most fertile evidence of their friendship actually lies, I think, in its aftermath. The friendship's abrupt conclusion left Dickinson emotionally raw. Susan's death was reported on the day of her funeral, December 5th, 1865, in the Springfield Republican, which the Dickinson subscribed to. No cause was attributed, though by this point she had succumbed to a serious illness. Within days, Emily reached out to like friends for stability and assurance. In a letter to Susan Dickinson, she called woundedly on the reasoning of Providence. Then in the concluding verse, funneled her thoughts into a balance of sorrow and gratitude for the friends that did remain. Her succeeding note to Elizabeth Holland voiced continued grief as she wrote, "It was incredibly sweet that Austin had seen you. To see one who had seen you was a strange assurance. It helped me dispel the fear that you departed too." And years later, Dickinson would still recall the day. Hidden among the poems which many scholars reference to explain Dickinson's solitude, biographer Alfred Habiger draws unusual attention to one which begins, "A wind that rose through not a leaf." And here is the manuscript. This is one of two poems which the poet inscribed with the date of Susan Phelps's funeral. Both take on themes of loss and memory. So as she sat alone to compose the poem, probably 6 years after Susan's death, it's clear that the pain of a memory accompanied gratitude for the friend's life. And here is that elegiac verse, which she punctuated with December 5th. "A wind that rose through not a leaf in any forest stirred, but with itself did cold commune beyond the realm of bird. A wind that woke a lone delight, like separation's swell, restored an arctic confidence to the invisible." So something rose through Dickinson, maybe on the date's anniversary or nudged by an imperceptible reminder, and she recalled the sweet imagination of Susan Phelps. A wind that does not blow on the earth in a literal sense is the spirit of a soul departed. This wind lives beyond the realm of bird, a phrase that flirts with heaven. It has left its initial world and companions, allowing for the mutual swell of separation. Then its stir brings a joyful moment of reconnection. The reflection on loss and remembrance evokes a fitting emotional temperature with the use of cold and arctic, and aligns with the season of Susan's death. The poem wonders at the nature of remembering. How do the living engage with those they have lost? We try, with the occasional success, to meet them in our thoughts, and we can also sense and recall them sometimes without warning or effort. Either way, the stirring is felt and oftentimes peacefully received. This bears resemblance to Dickinson's chilly peace infesting the grass in one better-known poem, but the stirring here is a more acute and personal experience. The cold heart's discovery of confidence in the invisible suggests a spectrum of hope and faith, from assurance that the friend once was to a sense that the friend still is. Reading the wind as a mobile spirit that comes from the cold to stir up the memory allows that the departed occasionally breathe on us for their own comfort. For Dickinson, it must have been a deeper comfort indeed to imagine that her remembrance was also the remembered's delight. And here is the other poem that she inscribed with Susan's funeral date. It begins, "The days that we can spare." The departure of the youngest Phelps daughter left a painful emptiness in her family and community, but her legacy is hopeful and resonant, as experienced in the bright colors of a stained glass memorial, as well as the stirring words of Dickinson's poetry. The summer after Susan's death, the Express announced the consecration of the First Episcopal Church building in Amherst. The paper reported that at Grace Church, the first window on the south side is in memory of Miss Susan D. Phelps of Hadley. The featured verses and symbols on her window reach pleadingly for a resolution to Susan's tragedy. Her ultimately fatal period of illness bears only speculative links to the trauma of her stepmother's death 1 month prior, and of learning that Emmons, her former fiancé, had married. Every factor, though, seemed to exacerbate her early decline at 38. Centered in these red shapes, my soul waiteth for the Lord until the day break and the shadows flee away, combines 2 Bible verses. Susan's patience and perhaps her faith endured through a great deal of shadow. Atop, on an anchor symbolizing God's grace, reads, "I look for the resurrection of the dead," a line of hope for those engaged in her remembrance below. So I'd like to hear your questions and comments in a moment, but I'll leave you with these final thoughts. Dickinson knew about this window, but it was past her hour for church attendance, and problematically, it was not her church. Could she have missed it? I like to imagine not. It might have taken her 6 odd years, which is the time between Susan's death and a certain poem, and then quietly sneaking into the empty sanctuary on a winter's day, she looked up, and perhaps a wind stirred. So thank you for your attention during all of that. And I would love to open it up now to any conversation or questions you might have. And I will stop the screen share.
So I can read you one question that came in through the chat while other people pull their questioning thoughts together. Could you speak more about the gender? Now it just shrunk. Hold on. Here. About the gender restricted world that the Dickinsons and Phelps inhabited during the early 19th century. Intelligent women like Susan and Emily courting Amherst College students or graduates while being excluded from that institution. Have you come across any archival evidence that addresses this sexism more directly?
That is a truly wonderful question. Well, to me, I think in my studies, I've kind of taken that for granted in a sense of knowing that women were so fully excluded from the student, literally from being students at that time, and from engaging in academics in the same way. So kind of being aware of that, what's caught my attention more in the lives and experiences of these 2 women has been the ways in which they've actually been involved. So that's not a great question. I wish, or that's not maybe the most direct answer. And I would encourage, you to read more. But in particular, with this friendship, Emily is very close with Henry Emmons, and they're really literary partners in a way. And that's then how she becomes friends with Susan. So yeah, and also being aware of Emily reading the journal that Henry helped to publish. And in particular, I'm just kind of thinking off the cuff of there's a note he writes when he's trying to advocate for the Indicator, the student publication, to to be published, and it really seems like he has Dickinson in mind. So I'm just especially interested in the ways that women in the town are involved. So I hope that isn't a totally unsatisfying answer, but you're very smart to ask that, for sure. Yeah.
Another more general kind of question that's shown up here is just asking you to talk a little bit about what drew you into thinking about these two women and this really interesting project.
Sure. Well, as Karen shared in my introduction, I worked for many years at I've been working for many years at the Emily Dickinson Museum, and then coming to the Porter-Phelps, what was so kind of cool to me was the way that expanded my understanding of local history, not just by constantly referencing kind of this one point person, but all of a sudden having this whole kind of bedding underneath of a family and a community that Dickinson was a part of. So what was really interesting to me about looking more into this link was doing just that. And Karen also spoke to it at the beginning of seeing Dickinson within a larger community. And that also connected me myself as somebody who's grown up in the Pioneer Valley to the history of this region in a way that was just much more real to me than it was when I was so hyper-focused on just, the poet herself.
One of the things that I'm so glad, I was part of the party that carried papers out of Phelps Farm. So I'm so glad that you're reading them actually, found new family letters that were relevant for this project in them this summer. But it was really struck in hearing your talk today about the I guess the mental health and emotional differences relations inside that inside the between the siblings and Phelps Farm, and I just really admire the very tender and respectful way that you write about that. And I know you said other people should go do more about this, but I sort of suspect that you have more thoughts about that you'd like to say too.
Yeah, thanks for drawing attention to it. One thing that really struck me doing that kind of personal research, train of thought. Oh yes, was kind of a different approach to caretaking for these individuals, for the different brothers. I focus on Billy because there is more, there's more about him in terms of his kind of social interactions with the larger community. But that struck me in particular because it really seemed like everybody was taking care of him and kind of befriending him in a different way than we tend to think of today, as each person deals with so exclusively within their nuclear family. But I felt that the Phelpses were open to having Billy wander around. And there's one particular anecdote about him mooching off of slices of pie from the farmers' wives. And I don't know if that's true, but just the idea of him going on lots of visits and being fed by people around the town was sweet.
So I want to really urge all of you good listeners, if there are a last question or two for Anna.
I just have a sort of general question about like, could you speak more to like the idea of like reconstructing this friendship through letters and accounts, and like what it's like to go through these letters and writings, and what it felt like to like have the documents in front of you?
Well, I love it. There's something just so moving and personal about reading someone's handwritten letter. I feel like that's been said many a time in these talks and ones like it. And so that's kind of where I start, is just immersing myself in the letters, and not trying to focus too much on just what I'm looking for, but reading the whole thing. And that's where I get into kind of observing, oh wow, she's really talking about such kind of everyday details, but in a very attentive way. And then I've also found that in my research process, at least, it's taken more imagination than I expected. So in order to kind of get somewhere, it helped me to really fully imagine out a scene, even somewhat beyond what's specifically in the letter, which I can do more easily because I'm really familiar with this area, especially in that first letter that I discussed with Susan Phelps. She's talking about Amherst College campus, and I wrote that paper when I was still a student. I wrote that section when I was still a student at Amherst. And so really imagining the scene to its fullest. And then as I discover more letters, I can go back and figure out where my narrative has gone a little off course. And that's been a delight too, as I'm looking at these new letters, to kind of reconstruct. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
Can I maybe ask you to say a little bit about, like, one thing that you're doing is thinking about the relationship and the contours of this friendship. And then I guess you're also offered us one really rich reading of a poem. And it felt like two different things were happening there. Knowing about Susan Phelps helped you to read that poem. Knowing, what that date written on the manuscript meant helped you to read that poem. And also that poem helped you to understand something about their friendship. And so I guess I'm wondering how you see poetry, like the place of poetry, and maybe also that difference. Like, a lot of the recovery in your work is the recovery of lives in this family that in general people haven't heard about. But then you also have this life that's been enormously studied, and there are lots of biographies of, and lots of scholarship on, and wondering what happens when you put those two together. Those were two different questions, I'm realizing.
Yeah, and great observations. Trying to think how best to respond. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where I'm seeing this project in particular tying into our talk theme here of bridging the past with the present. And of course, we have many different studies, different kind of schools of thought about art and a poem and its afterlife. And so I think I tried to consider multiple different kinds of the afterlives of a poem, because you can go back and you can look at the relationships and the history that are informing it, and you can also take it into the present and look at it today without all that, and that doesn't make it less meaningful. So I think that's partly why I really enjoyed digging into and being careful as I close read that poem again. And even as I was revisiting it in preparation for this talk, I found some new things that I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I missed this about the poem, just from recently reading different Dickinson poems, not connected to Susan Phelps. So I kind of needed that space in that case. I needed that space after thinking about it from such a context specific mindset. I needed that space to then come back looking at it with a more, with the context of her broader work, and just with a kind of clear vision of the poem itself. So both are valuable. Yeah, and that was fun to do.
Other questions? So I'll ask the second half of my way too complicated question again, and just sort of think about what's useful about putting a really famous and well-known life and a really unknown life prior to your research together.
It's useful because all lives are meaningful. And it's easy to feel like we're only doing something historically important if we look at somebody who, for some reason or another, is famous. But the Porter-Phelps Museum has already shown us that the contrary is true. And in some ways that can be more personally relatable too. It can be kind of easier to learn from the past if we're not looking at somebody who's famous. Easier to relate to that person and to see our own lives in them, or the differences. So, and for me personally, it made it meaningful to approach this project just as kind of a Pioneer Valley woman approaching another Pioneer Valley woman, albeit separated by centuries. So all lives are important and honorable, or worth approaching with that mindset. Yeah.
Okay. Here comes another lovely thing in the chat. There's a thank you. And we know intellectually that Emily Dickinson had a personal life and experience, but delving into the letters and her day-to-day life and friendships makes this mindful truth become more emotionally real. So more just a recognition of what it is that you've really accomplished in this work. And I think very, very true. And someone else noting that 95% of even famous people's interactions are with the unfamous.
Yeah. Very true.
And of course, Dickinson herself was not famous for most of her life, or maybe even all of her life. She may have been the more unknown of the two friends in some ways when they were alive. I just want to say what a complete, I don't know, really moving pleasure it's been for me to see this project keeping on growing, and so rich and deep, and just really lovely to listen to it.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to share, especially and kind of talk out some of that newer information. And the project is ongoing, so stay tuned for more.
Yes. Lots of wonderful and glad thank you messages coming into your chat.
Yay. Thanks, everyone. And looking forward to the next and final
Yes,
in our series as well.
that's right. And also related because about illness. So connecting to these themes in the presentations today. So August 18th, Ben Muchler and Robert Gross, and conversation about Ben's new book on sickness in early America, in which Phelps family papers figure large in his research. Go well. Thank you all so much for coming.